Okay. So thank you all for being here. We're sorry, we have a few people still coming in, and I'm trying to keep track of the waiting room, but welcome everyone. My name is Tanas Motavelli. I work here at the Decker Library. I'm the Collections Maintenance and Preservation Technician, and this event today is part of a larger event series that the Decker Library has been putting on since the fall of 2020. It's called Art in the Archive. This Art in the Archive is sponsored by the Decker Library in collaboration with the Art History Department. And the goal of the series is to explore the role of archives in the production of art and culture. We've had artists, writers, archivists, researchers, all who engage in the archives in meaningful ways. And I'm going to just start things off with some housekeeping and then introduce our wonderful speakers. So I would like to start first with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock tribes, that Indigenous people have lived here since the 10th millennium BC and have been joined through the northern migration by the Lumbee and Cherokee in this region we now call Baltimore. We also acknowledge the people enslaved and exploited who did and do work on this land, enabling us to live in Mother Earth from which all life springs. Here at MICA, we strive to honor the ancestors and work equitably and honorably towards social justice with their descendants. I'd also like to wrap up some housekeeping by providing our code of conduct for this space. Art in the Archive is dedicated to providing harassment-free event experience for everyone, regardless of race, gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, age, religion, marital status, or any other vector of identity. This is a space where we agree to work together to break down our implicit and explicit biases and agree to hold ourselves and others accountable for the ways that we contribute or subtract from safe and brave spaces. We point out harm when we see it and work together within community to speak up when and if we see event attendees experiencing microaggressions, unfair and or biased treatment, and inequitable exclusion. We will not tolerate harassment of any form. And then just to prepare you all for the format for today, we will start off with one presentation from each speaker that relates to their work and how they use archives in art and art education. And then we will take a deeper dive into a moderated discussion. And throughout the event, you can feel free to type questions in the chat. We'll be keeping track of those, and then we will integrate them into the discussion portion. Lastly, we have a audience feedback survey that we've put together that we would like you to fill out for any amount of the event that you attend, if you can. I'm going to put the link in the chat now so that everybody can access it, and then I will share it again sometime maybe after the presentations and right as we're beginning discussion. So yeah, your feedback and input is really helpful for us for planning future events like this, so we really appreciate it if you could fill those out. And now I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers. Sorry about all the housekeeping. So I'm going to first start off by introducing Dr. Pamela Harris Lawton. Dr. Lawton is the Florence Gaskins Harper Endowed Chair in Art Education and thought leader for the Hurwitz Center at the Maryland Institute College of Art. A fifth-generation educator from Washington, D.C., her scholarly research and teaching revolve around visual narrative and intergenerational arts and learning in BIPOC community settings. Her artwork is grounded in social liberation, seeking to illuminate contemporary issues, cultural traditions, and the stories of people impacted by them. Honors include the inaugural Pearl Greenberg Award for Teaching and Research in Art Education, Southeastern Region Higher Education Art Educator of 2017, 2019 Fulbright Distinguished Chair at the University of Edinburgh, and 2019 Associate Artist at the Tate Exchange in London. Lawton is also the co-author of Community-Based Art Education Across the Lifespan, Finding Common Ground, and many book chapters and journal articles. Her artworks are in private and institutional collections, including the National Museum of Women in the Arts, Frederick Douglass Museum and Cultural Center, and the Tate Britain Library. Also with us today is Nicole Marroquin. Nicole Marroquin is a teacher, educator, and an artist whose work explores belonging and spatial justice through histories of student rebellions in Chicago public schools from 1968 to 1980. Through research and creative practice, she aims to recover and represent histories of Black and Brown youth and women's leadership in the struggle for justice in Chicago. I just wanted to ask people to mute if possible while we get through these introductions. Thank you. Recently, she has presented projects at the Kochi Biennale, the annual conference of the American Association of Research Librarians, University of Maine, New York Archivist Roundtable, Jane Addams Hull House Museum, DePaul Museum of Art, on WLPN Lumpen Radio, Gallery 400, Hyde Park Art Center, and more. Her essays are included in the Visual Art Research Journal, Countersignals, the Chicago Social Practice History Series, Revista Contratiempo, Where the Future Came From, and Organize Your Own, the Politics and Poetics of Self-Determination Movements. She is a 2022 United States Artist Fellowship recipient, a member of the Just Seeds and Chicago ACT collectives, and chair of the Department of Art Education at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. All right, thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you everybody for getting through the introductions and the housekeeping. I'm going to pass it over to Nicole to get started on her presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the organizers for this fantastic opportunity. I'm really excited to be able to talk with y'all. And just to add a couple of images. Oh, also, please, if people could please mute their microphones if they're not, well, just me right now, I'd appreciate it, because I don't want to get off track. I'm going to, in fact, set a timer for myself so I can keep us on track. I'm a printmaker and a sculptor and a teacher educator, and I'm just going to bust right into what I want to talk to y'all about. I want to start by talking for just a second about this event that happened in 2019. I work on local history in a particular neighborhood that is possibly well known for being under the siege of gentrification right now, possibly as possibly the way it's most often talked about nationally. And in this neighborhood is a school. And in the school are students who visited an institution in the city of Chicago that is supposed to be talking about Chicago history, but had little to none in terms of Latinx history. And the students mounted a protest. I use this to start because I want to, during this very brief conversation, to present sort of a bigger view of things that have been going on around history, and to talk about why art education is so important. And so this is from the 1960, like a pamphlet about who are Mexican Americans that came out after the 1960 census. That where I'm from in Texas, clearly there's a number of people that were counted, but in Michigan and Illinois, where there were hundreds of thousands of Latinx people, particularly of Mexican descent, there were no people being counted, right? And so part of our work as teachers is to teach ourselves into existence, right? That's probably the reason I got into education. We wouldn't be the first people were we to take this charge up. This is a picture by an artist, an art educator I'm going to talk about pretty soon. But at Latino Youth High School, right, where Mexican and Mexican American students at this high school in the neighborhood had an 80% dropout rate. And around the time where this was sort of caught and brought to the attention of education officials who cared, they organized a sort of recapture schools, right, to capture the people that had been pushed out. And so we would not be the first. Notice everybody's smoking. um, and also let us find joy in this effort, right? Here's a fantastic photo of Lynn Bloom High School seniors posing in front of the Wall of Truth, which is directly across from the Wall of Respect. I found this in the yearbook when I was paging through looking for, oh, anything. I'll talk about drifting through the archives in just a second. And I found this incredible picture, likely taken by yearbook staff that were students. There's a lot of joy in this work of putting ourselves out and making our histories visible, but remain skeptical. I ask myself, what should we study and what are we preparing young people to do? And I'm a big fan of the scholar Maria Cotera, who says invisibility is an unnatural disaster, right? One's access to power determines one's presence in the archive, she says in her article. And that those who are furthest away from mechanisms of power are rarely represented in institutional archives. Consequently, their lives and interventions are rarely the subject of historical meaning making. This is a pretty powerful and massive statement taken out of a much larger article that I invite you all to pursue. But I also want to say that not only are scholars pursuing this and teachers pursuing this, making people present in the curriculum, whether or not they're present in the archive. But there are some fantastic efforts that are being made, such as this collection, the Barbara Cook Alternative Press Collection at the Chicago Public Library Special Collections at Harold Washington, that is all about a young person's work in creating alternative newspapers and collecting alternative newspapers while they were a high school student in Chicago. Really incredible work. But among the most important work that I've ever been involved in was working alongside Dr. Paulina Camacho, who is with us today, when I was doing research in her classroom at Benito Juarez, which she very generously opened to me. And we talked about the neighborhood being the library, right? The communities were the text and the neighborhood is the archive, right? And as the neighborhood was getting wiped out by gentrification, not wiped out, that's a wrong phrase, as it was being violently disrupted, that it was also the disruption of our library, essentially. And so this is an image where the youth each made a portrait of their homes, right? And here it is on exhibition with the work from the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. And by placing them together, we were actually able to look at a much longer timeline of Mexican ceramics. And then in the animation are collages students made from their own neighborhood, thinking about, the prompt was, what would you keep, right, moving forward? And to imagine the neighborhood of the future without your displacement. And so what are we really training our students to be able to do? What do they need to know? What are we thinking that they need to be participating in? Fantastic student work from the same class. So in the process, let me just kind of focus this a little bit. In the process of doing the research for the young people at Benito Juarez, when we were looking at local history, I came across a number of newspapers, and over time I realized I had a lot of Spanish language newspapers that I hadn't known about, that were actually produced by and for the Latinx communities in Chicago. And so this is actually an artwork that I just made recently. This is from a proof. It has not yet been editioned. It's a revision of a more recent work. But this is what I learned from the students that I worked with at the high school, is to actually just start making work that shows that this is not the first fight. There are people that came before us that have been involved in this struggle, and that presenting the work to each other and talking about it and creating communities of discussion around this work is really what sort of makes the difference. And so this is an artist, Diana Solis, who I'm going to talk about very briefly. I have immense respect for this photographer and illustrator and art educator who grew up in the neighborhood and was a photographer for about 25 years, and then sort of put the photography away and moved on to other work, and is still continuously teaching art, probably teaching art at this very moment. And what happened was, we got into a discussion. She told me she had this collection. I pressed her to go get it out of a basement. And then here we are today. And over time, since about 2018, we've presented and talked about her work in various settings. And the work is incredible. This is a picture of Casa Islam that she took. But just to show you how closely everything is meshed together, this is her students who were in a photography class that she was teaching at the Casa Islam, which incidentally is where I met her in 2009. And here is a self-portrait. She didn't take any multiples. Like this was one shot. There was a picture of a different person before it and after it. Diana is a master photographer. And so, like I said, over the course of time, I taught a course about actually opening up her collection and documenting and writing the descriptions. We've presented in a couple of different venues, and then also there's been this first exhibition at DePaul Museum of art around her work. And there's also been sort of this process of realizing, identifying these publications she's been involved in. Both of these covers are of her photos, and sort of going back and retracing her steps so that we can look at like a much larger CV. So why am I doing this? Because this is the person who built the road that I walk on, right? And so very recently, in the sort of top row, there's the aerial picture of the Poetry Foundation exhibition that we just took down. And on the left is Colleen, and then Diana and the curator Ariel at Latitude in Chicago, working on the material for the Photo Focus Biennial that was just in Cincinnati that's coming down shortly. Next, there's going to be an exhibition at the Leslie Loman Museum in March in New York. And then hopefully we will be mounting another exhibition in Chicago at Co-Prosperity Sphere in August. But like on the bottom left, you can see, Diana's still steadily like going through the images and identifying them. There's where she jumped in the shot of some of the founders of Thing magazine, the infamous Thing magazine, along with CC Hunt. And then also Diana's taken up photography again. So we're all working steadily on this. It is a very grassroots effort. If you can see behind me, this is the actual collection and where all the magic happens. I am the librarian. And just in closing, I want to talk very briefly about the experience I've had with this kind of intimate contact with her work. And that means I'm looking at experiments, photos that other people took of her, self-portraits, pictures that nobody was ever meant to see except for her, right? And it's been very powerful and life-altering, because I actually didn't even have a Latina teacher until I was in graduate school in about 16 years ago, and it was Maria Cotera, who I just quoted. And so this has been really an intense experience for me. And so what I've started to do is to go ahead and let my artist self respond. And this isn't just an art project that's kooky and on the side. I'm doing drawings of her hairstyles and hats and glasses and sort of eras representing her various iconic fashion times, because this is actually what my job is to go through this, almost 8,000 images and to be able to know what era they're in. And I do look at length of hair, like, is it over the ear? Is it, like, was this, which glasses styles was this? And so it's actually part of this index that I'm making based on hairstyles and hats and glasses. And that's about it. If you'd like to follow me or check me out, this is where you can reach me. And yeah, check out Diana's work. making work now. Hate to historicize her amazingness, but yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I think then next we'll have Pam do her presentation.
Okay, let's see. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invite. And anytime I get to hear Nicole talk about anything, it's just amazing to me. All right, so what I have here is basically a sort of different sort of presentation, because I'm taking this from my a more, I guess, a very personal place. So my introduction to the archives began with my family. And as a child, I grew up with two other generations of family, and I was surrounded by all these family ephemera and documents and stories. And that kind of got me very interested in history and digging into where I saw myself. Where did I see myself reflected as a way of going forward in my life and my career? So what you see here on the left is my great-grandfather, who in his retirement built doll houses, created a folding desk, sewing tables. And this is a newspaper article about him making these kind of detailed blueprints before he began his work. And the next, you see the brains and beauty at Minor. In my bio, you heard I'm a 5th generation art educator, or actually educator, from Washington, D.C. and teaching in D.C. schools. And that's my mom, who at that time was the 4th generation and the 3rd to go to Minor Teachers College. And over there above that is this certifies. That certificate is actually my great-great-grandfather's marriage certificate. And he was the, I guess you could say, like the valet or body man for Civil War General Philip Sheridan. And so Philip Sheridan signed that and was present at his wedding. And then below that, you see a page from the Congressional Record that gives the names and salaries of teachers in 1868, when the colored public school system started in the city of Washington, D.C. And my great-great-grandmother was one of the first 25 teachers hired. So that little bar kind of is Christiana Butcher and her salary, which was $600 a year at the time. Next to that, you see a book that says They Knew Lincoln. And I put that there because the author of that book was a friend of my great-great-grandfather's, and he wrote a book about all the Black people who either knew or were close to Lincoln in some way. And it tells the first page of the book tells the story of my great-great-grandfather having this painting of Lincoln from life, which was in the family home, that had been given to him by General Sheridan, and Lincoln had given it to him. So this is like some of the stuff that I encountered as a kid growing up. So from that, I started to make art to find myself based in these stories and artifacts that I was exposed to as a kid. And so, what you see here is a photograph as part of my great-grandfather's portfolio that he had, of photographs of his work, of one of his folding desks. So he sold these things, and I think he actually made more money selling his woodwork projects than he did from his government retirement. He attempted to get that patented, but when he made contact with somebody at a store, and they said, "Oh, sure, that sounds great." And when they met him, this Black man, I guess they decided, well, no, we don't really have an interest in that kind of thing. So he wound up publishing the plans for it in this Deltagram, which was a craftsman's magazine. And so that's what that page is from. It's so that anybody could make the desk. I happened to have one of these desks, and so I turned it into an artwork that told the story of him and his life and retirement. And so it's covered with photographs of his work, wood engravings that I did of him, and other little things just about him. On the desk are some hands that I created in clay of him in the act of writing up his detailed blueprints that he did for everything he made. And at the bottom there, where it says Papa Will's Miniature Village, is an artist's book that I created about his life after retirement. and my sister and I playing with one of the dollhouses that he built. So this book here was just recently in a MICA faculty show, and it's in the National Museum of Women in the Arts collection. So it's adding to the archive there in that sense. This was all part of another show that I did where it was sort of a installation I had for my grandmother, because she was a huge impact on my life. She was the one who shared with me all of these documents. She would give me really precious family things to take with me to school. Who knows, you know, I took care of them, thankfully, but that's kind of a risky thing. But this rocking chair is kind of collaged with things about her. And on it is an Afghan that she crocheted. She taught me how to crochet. That box, this was like a kind of my grandma's hands sort of installation, and things my grandmother did with her hands. And so here you see hands in cast paper, and they're writing in a diary. So my grandmother was a huge diarist. She kept diaries from the age of 18 to 92. And she gave those to me right before she died. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that archive, but every year on my birthday, she would call me and read what she wrote the day I was born. And this other piece is one of a print series about the men in my family who served in the military. And this was one of my uncles who served in World War II, who later became a writer. And some of his original poems that I just happened to find in my grandmother's papers, you know, he typed up. So I included images of those. Now, thinking about how I use the archives in art education history research, which I've done quite a bit recently. I never thought of myself as a history researcher, but when people started asking me questions like, well, you know, Pam, you're this 5th generation educator, you know, what was art education like for Black people during segregation? Do you know? Can you find out? And so I started doing these projects. So this is one of the most recent ones that I've done. And a lot of it kind of connects back to my own experience. So a lot of what I research in terms of art education history in some way connects to me or my family or some other interest that I have. So the reason I'm a printmaker is because I had a very transformative experience as a high school student growing up in DC. The Smithsonian American Art Museum had a printmaking studio in one of the gallery spaces when I was a kid. And what they did was, because this was like during as a result of the 1968-69 push by African Americans all over the place in urban areas that wanted more. They wanted more for themselves. And the arts was one area that they were really pushing in DC. So they wanted more arts classes. They wanted more access to the arts. And so this program was kind of started for that, because the museum was located close to the very first land grant institution in DC, which later became University of DC. And so they were looking to build an art program. So the museum said, well, we could fill some of that gap. And one of the things they did was they started this printmaking studio. And that's me in high school working on a stone lithograph. And that was in, I hate to say it, but 1977. So the program started in 71 and went on for almost 25 years. So I just had my own experience, but I wanted to research the program, why it came into being, because I didn't know all that background, and why it ended. And so I started doing this research in 2020, right around the time of the pandemic, unfortunately. But I went to the Smithsonian's website and I looked up all the numbers for the papers that would archive this program. I got all the information. I sent it to the Smithsonian. I said, I want to come there and look at these documents. So they pulled all this stuff for me. It was like 10 years worth of documentation on this program from 71 to 81. And so I'm going and I'm digging through all these boxes and I'm finding this photo of me, finding this catalog that I helped create, because the students created a catalog of their experience every year. And I got to the point where I said, well, I want to come back and pull the records from the last 10, 15 years of the program. And they said, sorry, lady, you need to do what you need to do now because we're shutting down for the pandemic. And so what happened was I wound up telling the rest of this story by Zoom interviews with people who taught in the program. And it all became a book chapter in an anthology about museums. And so this was a museum school community project. And it was one of the reasons that a lot of children of color got introduced to professional level printmaking. The other article that I wrote, actually the first one, was because I was asked by a colleague, what was art education like for Black students in DC early on? And so I said, well, how can I find out? And I just remembered this painting of my great-grandmother that was in my grandmother's home. And she told me that my great-grandmother's art teacher painted it. And his name was Thomas Hunster. So I said, well, let me see if I can Google this guy and find out, what was going on. Come to find out, he was not only the art teacher, but he started art education for children of color in DC. He was like a one-man everything. He was Alma Thomas's teacher. He started the teacher education program for art education. He taught at the high school. He was the supervisor for art education. And what I wound up doing, because I couldn't find a lot of him on the internet, is I went to the Sumner School Museum and Archives, which is where they house all of the papers for the public school system in DC from its very beginnings in the early 1800s up to present day. And I found his primary source reports of what he was doing for the art education program year over year. So I had in his own writing what he was doing. And I'm telling you, he was doing stuff when Walter Smith was doing it in Massachusetts. So it wasn't all the white men in Massachusetts, deciding what should happen in education. So I found, I was curious, like, well, how was he taught art? Where did he go? And he went to Antioch College in Ohio. The first president of that was Horace Mann, who actually was very instrumental in getting drawing into the public school curriculum. And I talked to a special collections librarian there. And that librarian sent me some images from documents that they had showing that, yes, he was a student there, and that he sent me the curriculum, and the curriculum had no art in it at all. So I was like, how did he get trained? Come to find out that the school believed in students going out into the community to do practical work related to whatever their interests were. And he was an apprentice to a portrait painter. And that other document you see there is the 1870 census from Ohio, and it lists him as an apprentice painter. So he went on to work with this teacher who taught him for many years. This guy had been in the Civil War. He went on to become a portrait painter of presidents, yet Hunster himself was primarily a landscape painter. So I thought it was curious that he painted this portrait of my great-grandmother. For 5 years, he painted portraits, he said, to help him get better at his landscape painting. So what you see here is one of his landscape paintings that I did find on the internet, and his home that he had built, which oddly, I found out doing my research that one of my cousins owned the home. And come to find out that because Hunster and his wife did not have children of their own, her grandmother was their godchild, and he left the house to her. So I thought that was a weird fact. There were lots of mentions of Hunster in the newspaper. So I went to the Library of Congress, where they have these digital newspaper records, and found him listed there, like this great art teacher doing all these art shows with his students. And so he was listed in all these places, but it was just hard to find him unless you knew where to look. I kept reading about him doing this amazing exhibit that went to the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. And he did this amazing diorama about slaves coming off of the plantation and then getting educated and, becoming, bettering their lives. And if you look where that little picture says Negro exhibit, that is the actual exhibit that Du Bois put together. And underneath there is the diorama. That is the only thing I could find of this artwork that he created. So all this time I've been looking for him, wondering what he looked like. And as an artist, I couldn't find anywhere where he did a self-portrait, couldn't find any photos of him, though people say they exist. So I am still looking for him in the record. But someone who read my research and works as a curator at the Columbus Museum in Georgia sent me this note that was in Alma Thomas's papers that describes him. And it says, Hunster, a very dapper gentleman, blonde with piercing blue eyes. And I said, that's unusual for an African-American man. but I'm still looking for him. So that's one way I went to several archives to piece together this story. So that in that way, I've added to the archive because most of the texts, the classic texts that we use in the history of art education, the big one was there's no person of color mentioned in there at all, really. No artists, educators of culture, color are mentioned. And so in this way, we are adding by doing this research, writing journal articles, and so that people who are teaching these classes, like me, have some other stories other than this one text that kind of pushes us even further into the margins. So that's one way of adding to the archive as a researcher. This page kind of shows some other things that are going on here. So this piece that says Richard Jones, that's my great-great-grandfather, who was the valet to General Sheridan, and I had some of his actual artifacts in my family collection, and they are now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the 3rd floor. So if you want to see it, there's his diary outlining his travels with the general in Yellowstone and his pearl-handled revolver. Other ways I've tried to add to the archive, I'm in a collective with other Black women artists about my age, and we just did a huge book project, collaborative book project on the year 2020 and how it impacted us. And currently, the Library of Congress is hoping to get that from us and put it in their collection. And so we want to add documents that we kept as a part of that process. This new book that just came out, which is a love letter to the original book, This Bridge Called My Back, which is a book dedicated to feminists of color and their practice as artists. So I have a piece in that book. That's another way of trying to add to the archive and put ourselves back from the margins into the center. During my Fulbright at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, I was there with other scholars, and we were all talking about the research that we were going to be doing. So I was talking about doing this book project with youth of color in Edinburgh, and they said, well, would you do it with us? We'd like to do one. So we did an altered book together, and it was based on marginalized populations, and so and women in particular. So this altered book is a part of their scholarly collection there at the University of Edinburgh, which I think is kind of a fun thing. This was the project that I did at the Tate Exchange. And what I wound up doing was buying 35 books, basically written from the master narrative point of view. And I put them out, and I had 1,800 people over the course of 5 days come through and alter the books, adding stories from the margins to these books. And so what wound up happening was the Tate Britain decided they wanted all the books, so they are in the Tate Britain's library in that archive. And here's the book that I made for that. I came across this book. It was called Clever Girls Who Became Famous Women. And not a one person was a person of color. I mean, this book was written in the 1800s, 1860s, but still, to me, that was no excuse. So I altered the book and added all of these Black women to the book. And so it's now Colorful Clever Girls, and that's in their collection as well. So thinking about archives and teaching, this is the project that I did with the youth of color and migrants from different countries, Southeast Asia, Africa, Spain. While I was in Edinburgh, they decided to do a book project, but they wanted to do a project on how people should be treated because they were not treated very well as migrants, and particularly migrants of color. There's a project that I did in Richmond when I was at BCU, and we did an alphabet book that honed in on a specific neighborhood where this youth center was located called 6 Points Innovation Center. And so my students and youth from the center created 6 books that were then given. 2 books were given to the main library in Richmond, 2 were given to an elementary school library in the neighborhood, and 2 stayed with the youth center. So it's an alphabet based on Richmond history and social justice themes. And this last thing is how I've used the archives in my teaching. So last semester, I taught the Foundations in Art Education course, and I thought, well, you know, I paired the classic text with a text by an education scholar, Joel Spring, who's Native American, and writes about all the people who are marginalized. And so I took some pages from the classic art education history text and blew them up. And I asked my students to put the people who are in the margins on the center of the page, whoever they wanted to pick. And so one student, Kayla Foreman, picked Gloria Ladson Billings, who, you know, took the critical race theory that came out of critical legal studies and applied it to education. And then another student, Lillian DeHart, took Marie Laurencin, who I'd never heard of, a French artist who was a cubist, who was active with Picasso and all the white guys, but I'd never heard of her. And then that's my my sample piece, which was about Elizabeth Catlett and Nancy Prophet. And Elizabeth Catlett was one of the first people to get an MFA when the MFA degree started at the University of Iowa. She was among the first 3 people. And Nancy Prophet was the first Black woman to graduate from RISD. And she was also an art educator at Spelman. So that's all I have. That's a QR code to my website, and I'm welcoming any questions that you might have. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you both so much. Your work, both of your work is extremely interesting. I love the way that not only as artists are you really digging, truly digging through the archive, and sometimes having to go across so many different institutions just to find the missing information, but that you're also passing that on to art students and future educators. I think it's like extremely exciting work. And I guess I just want to start by saying, or by asking one general question. You both have talked about, both to me and in your presentations, that you've done a lot of work to be in the archives with your hands, getting into those spaces, but not all of those spaces are accessible to different types of people, particularly people on the margins. And I'm just curious what you two think about, you know, what work needs to be done both from archivists, artists, and art educators to make those spaces more accessible, make them more friendly, make them physically more approachable. I'm just curious what thoughts you have on that.
I have I have a lot of thoughts about that. But I think that in art education, we have an advantage that is also sometimes a burden, which is that we are without disciplines, right? Necessarily, we're in education, we're in art, but when you think about what do you need to know to teach art, it's like there's a lot of things, right? It's very broad, and when we're in the field, we focus on what we want to focus on or what needs to be focused on, but really there's there's a lot we need to know, right? And yeah, I think one of the difficulties for people considering working in a formal archive is that there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. You used to have a letter of invitation. You used to have an affiliation with an institution. And in some places, yes, you still do, right? You need to have a very specific list of things that you want to look at. You're not wandering around and picking up boxes and touching them, right? Like in most places, there's no browsing, right? And sort of these steps are surrounded with mystery. But I think that a lot is being done right now to remove barriers and to create a more open environment. Still, I've heard that there is some scholarship on feeling unwelcome in archives. And there's a lot of work to be done, but I think that's one of the reasons I'm into being in them and making work about the actual like act of being there, and what it's like is to popularize it, democratize it, you know, get more people involved. I think that they'll be accountable to us more, the more of us that are using it, right? Just for example, the Newberry lowered their age for entry to 14. That's a big deal, right? One had to ask, why would you have to be 18 or you know, to look at history? But that's a separate question. I have a lot to say about that. I will can it for now.
I think I'm just going to say that I think making their information about how they want the public to come in and use their resources. So much is digital. So many people look for their information on the internet, and you know, libraries were a huge thing when I was growing up. Like every week, my mother made us go and we had to get books and report, you know, so just going into a library or any kind of institution like that was a huge, important thing. But I get it too, because some of those spaces were very off-putting, particularly for youth. You know, you had to be quiet, you know, or in DC, you know, there's a guard always looking through your bags when you go in any place. And so some of that is really off-putting. But as I was mentioning before we started, took my students to Enoch Pratt yesterday, and the fine arts librarian was so excited to see them and saying, oh, look, we've got this, we've got that. So trying to find a way, I think, to get that enthusiasm across, that the actual people who are in these spaces working with researchers and would-be researchers is so important. I mean, I feel somewhat fortunate because being in this area, and probably you as well, Nicole, is being in an area where there are a lot of archives for people of color, about people of color, like, you know, the museums, some of the museums on the mall, the Moreland Spingarn Room at Howard University, places like that, where because our information wasn't anywhere else, if we wanted to find something, we knew where to go because that's where they had those records. Of course, I would love to see them in these more mainstream archives as well, but I think part of it is, you know, start with yourself. What is it that you're interested in? That's one way of getting people fired up. You know, where don't you see yourself? What do you want to know about, you know, people like you, and then the history of people like you, your neighborhood, the history of your neighborhood. I think there are a lot of things out there. It's just that there's not a really great job of letting people know what's out there and what's available. And like I said, you know, I think so many of these archivists and special collections folks want to talk to people, and that they will make themselves accessible, but it's more about letting people know what's out there and available to them is a big part of it.
Yeah, I want to sort of point out something that I think Nicole is starting to talk about, but you know, the archive supports a very Western scholarship of history, and also colonial scholarship of history, where we assume that there is a specific truth, there is a timeline of what actually objectively happened, and that sense of objectivity is what pushes people out, because that's not the way that the past happened. The past is a bunch of different perspectives from a bunch of different people, and they are sometimes contradictory. And I think one thing that I love about both of your work is that you point out how much artists can sit with the unknown, which I think is something very specific that the arts teaches people how to do, to be okay with the in-between, the not knowing, because really what's in the archive is not the truth, it's fragments of the truth. And then there's all this stuff in between. So I'm just curious, how do you guys feel about, like, what can artists do to, I mean, in Nicole's words, democratize these spaces, not just, you know, the physical space, but the scholarship, the understanding, and the way that we think about history, the way that we think about the archives as supporting that history, and how important is giving artists the chance to work in these spaces. What does it do for the future of how people document?
This is I mean, I don't think artists can fix everything, but this is something artists can definitely fix. I mean, we're difficult, I think, to some archivists because we want to drift. We want to look at a lot before we can say what it is we want to do, right? But we have a couple unique roles. One is, you know, teaching visually. Like, we're superheroes with this, you know. I start to go through a collection and I'm already like figuring out how to teach it to middle school because that's sort of my zone. And if I can, like, what's going to be the thing that's going to grab their attention? What's going to be, you know, the image I show large, and then what am I going to introduce slowly, you know? I think there's some incredible power of having educators in archives as well to spread the word. I mean, it's just really an underutilized resource, is the mass amount of teachers who really love to get their hands on some exciting information, right, that they can fit into their curriculum, or better yet, have some things prepared for these busy teachers in the world. But another thing, besides like us potentially adding like lots of sexiness to the idea of being in archives, and then telling everybody about it, which is what we do, is we also notice things, right? Art school is almost like the school of learning how to notice things while they're happening around you, right? And like, for example, I started taking pictures of articles and things. I'm not a graphic designer at all. And I started taking pictures of these newspaper mastheads because I was like, wow, we had a lot of newspapers dedicated to our communities. Where are they? What happened? We had like 2 all of a sudden, you know, and here there was like 55 that I fit on a single piece of paper. So I was trying to figure out what it meant. And then, you know, that's an artwork. I don't know what the answer is. Why, what happened? You know, I'm just asking the question. So we have that ability, right? Dr. Pam said this. I'm going to call you Dr. Pam just to meet you in the middle. Was talking about like this, not having to have like the single answer, or being able to ask a question with the work and being curious and showing the curiosity. I think that's like a incredible opportunity. Having a question is enough provocation to make the work.
Yeah, I would say, like, especially for artists and art educators, like, I don't think we always think of the archive as being just documents, or, and especially for people with a background like mine who are African Americans, whose names were not even in a lot of these documents that go back. You can't even really find a particular person a lot of times, right? So I think the idea that people, like, I think we all in some sense collect things and don't even think about them being an archive. I think some of this is about educating people about what an archive can be. You know, when I went to try to find stuff on Hunster, I mean, I went everywhere because this guy at one time, he was hot stuff in DC, you know, in the 20s and 30s. And then by the 50s, after they'd done a big retrospective of his work at Howard University, he just kind of died out, right? But when I went to the public library, I guess it would be sort of like the Enoch Pratt in DC, the MLK library, because they have a lot of documents. They have an archive there on Washingtonia, you know. They told me, oh, please, you know, bring us some stuff about yourself. You know, we want to add to our archive and invite people to come and bring us stuff about what their life was like in Washington, you know. They have a huge, and this is one thing that's great. They have a huge thing where they do outreach to the public. It's the DC History Conference. And so anybody can give a presentation about any aspect of DC history that they want. And that was where I went and met somebody who then later on sent me that description of Hunster that he found in an archive. So I think it's very interesting, like these neighborhood libraries, community centers, they all have some history. Like, I guess in DC, the Anacostia Museum, which is the Smithsonian's neighborhood museum, they have a huge archive. That's where I found some of my great-grandfather's dollhouses. It's got one of them there. They also had some of Hunster's paintings there, but they didn't even put that up on their website until somebody read my article, seriously. And then I looked up and all of a sudden, all this stuff is on their website. So I think, you know, there's different ways of doing it. And I think that's part of our role too, when we go someplace as artists and researchers and we ask these questions and let them know this is stuff people are interested in. You need to find a way to let people know what you have here and how people can come there for information. I really do think that that's a huge part of it, because even these archives that aren't dedicated to to the white narrative, don't really have a way of letting people know as well that they're out there. And I mean, it could be resources, but I think they just have to have a better way of, getting their story out there as an archive, and how important it is to have people use those archives and add to them. I mean, the interpretation that I put on Hunster's story may or may not be correct, right? But it was based on stuff that I found within my own family and in archives and talking to other people. So I told it from my perspective. And that's what history is, right? It's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different lenses, and then people interpret them in different ways. So
Yeah, I can't help also but think that it's also important to have certain people interpret them more often than others, because there have been a certain type of person that has interpreted historic information. So I'm just curious, and I thought it was really interesting when Pam's talking about the art education history research, and how COVID obviously impacted that, the steps you took, and you were then led to basically do an oral history project. Nicole, I was curious, have you ever had an experience like that, or basically what other ways have you both found information somewhere outside of the archive because the archive didn't have what you needed?
Well, part of my problem is, and is that they said we weren't even here, the incredible Dr. Lilia Fernandez wrote Brown in the Windy City and went to the library to find information. And they said, oh, Mexicans weren't here until the 1920s. And it's like, no, that's changed, right? Like, because of her work, right? Her diligence and her insistence and her being like, see, so what she found had to be found otherwise, right? In part, combining what she could find in these formal archives. Like they didn't collect Mexican history per se. There are a handful of small collections, but there was much more on Latinx Chicago history I found outside of Chicago. And while Chicago is now making moves to collect this history, there's been damage done by the lack of collecting, right? Like there's a lot of things have been lost. So what happens is people came to me personally as an individual human in my tiny office to say, here, I have these things, or, oh, do you know about this? Or could you do something about this? And I'm like, I have small children. I'm a ceramic sculptor. I probably shouldn't be the one to hold this material, right? But where should it go? And where would it be safe? Where would it not disappear into that freaky void where nobody knows the Google terms to see, not everybody knows Boolean phrase or search phrases. How can we make sure that this stuff doesn't just get sucked up into some, miscategorized, thanks to, the categorizing and describing is its own entire conversation that we could have. But no, I found the entire history of the Black and Latinx student uprisings that, spawned all the projects I did in Paulina Camacho's class with all of her incredible students, came from a conversation I had in a coffee shop with a guy that just was there. I started Googling and found pictures on eBay. Like, this was not a known history. I started asking, and one person hung up on me and said, why do you want to know about this? And then hung up. Because the Red Squad, a secret arm of Chicago police, had terrorized people and threatened to kill people, right? So that's like COINTELPRO, local COINTELPRO. And the Chicago History Museum now has their boxes, but yeah, it is not for scholarly use, so I cannot report on it. But this is not, an accident. It was like a concerted effort to keep these people down and histories out of people's eyes. And now look at what we have. Look at what is actually happening. And so students marched in the street and shut things down in order to have their history and their stories be part of the curriculum. That happened, right? This is what they were fighting against. And I just love studying the history of student uprisings. And I'm just here to say, I will bring snacks and provide rides.
I want to add to that, Nicole, because that's happening right now. Like I think about what's happening in Florida, right? So people who want to know about their history, so like this, all this suppression, critical race theory, all of that, it makes me think that we are the ones, I mean, it's unfortunate, but we tend to be the ones who have to get our history into the archive or to find it in there. I'm not sure how many other people would be really as interested as we are. It makes me think about Ashley Minner, who's a MICA alum and curator, historian, and member of the Lumbee tribe, and which had a pretty well-known presence in Baltimore, but it wasn't all correct in the archive. And so she went to her Lumbee relatives and said, hey, here's a map of what they're saying, where all this stuff was, which is all gone now. And they're like, no, wait, that's not right, da, 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 da. And so I think in a way, this whole oral history piece is very crucial as well, because like you said, the way something is interpreted, like you said, Tanaz, is not always correct, or it's missing a lot of things. And so having, I think as educators, talking to students about wanting to do that work, where, seeing yourself out there and maybe being the person to make sure that you're there, to get that interest in them, to push for it is so important.
Yeah, thank you both so much. There's a question in the chat from Felix Rodriguez. Can you elaborate more on the methodologies you use to examine/build archives? Do you have a strategy in mind when you start, or is it something that just flows with the data?
Ooh, I have a couple of different approaches. And so like with art making, you don't go in and say, okay, I picture an outcome, I'm just going to color in the coloring book. The process actually shapes the outcome, right? And it is the sensitivity to like the materials, right? The material culture, the things that are happening with the actual items themselves, which is why, digital research is awesome, but when you can touch something, it's like artists, I'm like, short of smelling the boxes, I want to get into it, it's not just looking at paper. I mean, I make paper, I am interested in it and the way that the print, is on the surface of the paper, right? And so I'm not always sure what it is I'm going to make or what the result will be, because that's going to be shaped based on the need. What is the work asking me to do, right? I don't have a prescribed system. But the way that I simplify that, like in an application, for example, when I want to go to an archive or when I say I want to look at things, I say, and sometimes this just makes it worse, but I say I'm going on a drift, right? And I know actually that scholars do this also, like regular academics, because you don't just read only things in your field, you read other fields, you think about other things, you go to places that are not just the thing that you're concentrating on, and things occur to you, right? You enjoy the arts and poetry, right? Like I can be as much inspired and moved by a song that causes me to pursue some aspect of, I found this picture in Diana Solis's material, which, is headed towards a formal archive. We're very much hoping it does make its home at the Newberry. But I found this picture of the rally in Lincoln Park at the end of the Gay Pride March, right? And in this park is where there's like music playing and a rally and all this fun bands play and stuff. And there was this picture of these two young women wearing tour jerseys from the band Heart, and one of them is holding a brown paper bag that has records in it. And I looked up the date of that year's Pride March, and it was the day after a concert where Heart played in Rockford, Illinois. And then I found a recording of that was actually posted online, and I could hear what was happening. I mean, there are thunderclap moments. I don't know what that's going to turn into, but I put all those pieces together and started to get real excited about that photo, right? Being a former heavy metal girl who wants to think about that history too, right? Who wants to weave queer history and heavy metal history together, you know? And so I can't say that there is something, you know, uniting all of these approaches, but yeah, I have a lot of concerns about land and representation and justice and access. But I would say that would be the only kind of through line. I don't know, not to complicate it.
I would say for me, it depends on whether I'm doing a scholarly project or an art project. The one about Hunster is so strange. I mean, like that painting, I grew up with that painting and never really thought about it. It wasn't until someone asked me a question. So like as a scholar, as an educator, if I'm reading something and I don't see what I feel like I should be seeing, that might start a question. Or if someone asks me a question, that could be the beginnings of a research project. And for those, because I'm looking for myself in everything, whether it's my art making or the archive research work that I'm doing. I kind of start with, you know, where am I in here, or people like me? And that's kind of like what drives what the project becomes. So I started with that painting of my great grandmother for that one, and then started reaching out to family members who gave me this other stuff that I didn't even know about. And then just going into places. So in that sense, that started with the question somebody asked me. The other one was like my curiosity about that printmaking program, like what happened to it, why it was gone, and didn't I wish I had something like that now that my students could go to. One of the projects that I'm working on right now has to do with Black joy, because I get so tired of the trauma all the time. So I decided, you know, I had a great childhood. I'm going to sit down here. I've written all these short stories about episodes from my life, and I have begun, I'm going to be illustrating them. So I have this book project I'm going to be working on at a residency. And I was sitting at that DC history conference, and there was a panel of Black women scholars. One was from Chicago, a couple were from DC, and I was so excited about what they were saying. One scholar was talking about the year 1968 and how she got tired of all this talk about how it was so traumatic for Black people, that everything was horrible in 1968. So she decided to do a project where she was interviewing people, going into their personal archives who lived through 1968 and getting their stories. And as I was sitting there listening to her at this panel, all of a sudden I yelled out, which if you know me, you could imagine me doing that. And I said, oh my God, I was in the 4th grade in 1968 and James Brown came to my elementary school and played a concert. Now, how could I forget that, right? So I've decided that's going to be one of my short stories. And now what I want to do is go back to my elementary school to see if they have any images in their archive from that, because I never thought about it. I tried to see if there was anything in the Washington Post about it, but that was a big deal, because I can remember, you know, you don't forget things like that, but they just kind of get lost at some point until something triggers it. And I can remember the girl in my class who said, I know James Brown, I can get him to come to the school. And we were all like, whatever. And damn if he didn't come. Put on a concert in the auditorium. And if you want to see some grown women jumping up and screaming like they were at a Beatles concert, and the kids are like, what is up with the teachers? But see, little things like that. And that could be something that's in an archive somewhere. Somebody documented that, you know. So it just depends on what it is. I can't say that I always think of things ahead of time, but I do have a method that I like to use when I'm writing about art education history research. And I use the portraiture method, and I've called it critical portraiture because I'm looking specifically at people of color and their histories. And the portraiture method involves you as the researcher on the frame of that portrait, so that your story is integral to the story that you're telling, but it's not the main story because it's on the frame. So I don't know if that helps.
Great. We have another audience question. How do you get an archive to help you with your drift? or get them to support browsing when you don't have a targeted or specific research question. Have you had any positive experiences with archives that helped either of you in this type of wandering interaction with materials?
I've had some great experiences because librarians and archivists are amazing humans. First, it started with my school library. And I was like, I'm looking for this thing and I can't find it. And I'm looking at this copy of a dissertation and the pictures aren't good. And they said, the next day, somebody said, hey, we found that there's a print copy in a warehouse. And they drove to a warehouse and went and fetched it and brought it to me. I was like, what? Me? Librarians want to help in a way that I just had, I slept on it. I'll be honest. I did not, I mean, the joy that they expressed when I asked them questions that were like befuddling to me, I respond really well to that. I will come back. The way I started to work in archives is not knowing anything. I walked in and I said, I'm trying to find something, a picture, any picture of this one building where there was this student uprising 2 blocks from my house, right? Huge building, largest building in the neighborhood. Couldn't find a single picture of it. It took me 2 years. Went to 3 different archives. I said, what happened to it? Where did it go? There was this massive uprising that was on television and there's not a photo of it. I can't even find the permits for the demolition in Permitville, Chicago. So I would just go in and say, hey, I'm looking for this intersection. And they were like, what's the neighborhood? I would be like, Lower West Side, South Side, West Side. I mean, it's a contentious topic. I realize this. And it was very difficult to find information about it. But in the meantime, I said, well, just bring me the box of pictures. And, sort of under the cover of a very specific thing, I was able to just cruise around and I found a newspaper that, oh my gosh, for a while I was just looking at pictures of people who were living politicians who were around who had amazing mustaches in the 70s. Things that make me crack up. Like, really, honestly, what gets me going is, oh my gosh, that's hilarious. I can't believe it. I also looked through like 10 entire issues of the Chicago Seed to find one paragraph this big to show that the student uprisings in 68, which were right after the Democratic National Convention, right, were in fact overlapping with the Tlatelolco massacre in Mexico City, which is around the time when the Mexican students joined the Black students who were leading this effort, right? But like that, this was kind of a known simultaneous thing somewhere, and I found it. And I ran around showing people, and I don't know if anybody was as excited as I was, but I was like, I knew it, And so I don't know. It's like there's a couple books about, intrigues in the archives, if you want to nerd out about that stuff. But I think it's this, like a mystery or an unknown or something that you're intrigued by. And if not, I asked archivists and they were like, oh, you might want to look at so-and-so's collection. Have you heard of her? And I'm like, no, I've never heard of this human. This Italian anti-gentrification activist, Florence from the West Side, who had all this incredible material she had collected about the urban renewal that was really crucial to, it's brick by brick. You look at it, you may not use it, eyeball it, careful with your filing because it will build up fast. I recommend against having a single folder that is called historic material. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to do it. What do you think?
I like that term drift because I never thought about it before, but I think that librarians and archivists are amazing human beings and they want to help you. I mean, of all the places that I went around DC and wound up contacting the school out in Ohio, they all had another suggestion for me. And one of them was somebody said, well, I think that there was an exhibit of artists from the first 15 years of the 20th century in DC, and you might find something on Hunster there. And sure enough, there was a catalog with his work in it, and talked about other people who were artists during that time. I mean, it's like one story led to another story. So like, while it started with my family contacts, from the painting to the picture of his house, I then went to other places. Like I went to the library to find out like houses on the historic register, to find out more about his house, and, come to find out that he built it to his own specifications in the studio. So there were all these other little stories. And the one that I didn't mention was, as I was trying to find an image of him, and I'm still looking for it, is that his friend, the one that he studied with when he was a college student and later, was apprenticed to this guy, Silas Uhl, his friend painted a portrait of him called The Viking. And I was so I was looking for this painting, and guess who owned it? The guy who wrote They Knew Lincoln. He owned the painting. So all these weird threads like they started coming together. So I said, why would a white artist use a Black artist as a model for a painting called The Viking? And then when the person sent me the description of him that I just got last year, of him being this blonde-haired, blue-eyed man, I said, okay, so now that makes sense why somebody would use him as a model for that. So this is just so weird. So last month, I came across this scholar who had They Knew Lincoln republished. So the book was originally published in the 40s, like 1940. She said she felt the guy who wrote this book was amazing, and that it needed to be republished and put out there again. So I wrote to her and I said, listen, I'm the great-great-granddaughter of the guy mentioned in the book, and I'm trying to find a painting that this guy owned, blah, blah, blah. She said, the guy never had kids, but I looked into his obituary records, right? Who thought of it? To see who his next of kin was. She said, you might try to follow that path to see if you can find this painting. So all of this, I'm still looking for an image of the man, but like all these really weird things. So, as soon as one person knows something you're doing, they can think of somebody else. And people really want to help you because they want to see these stories come to light. I really do think they do. And so that's part of like I said, like you said, Nicole, it's ongoing. It's like it doesn't really stop. These stories have a life that keeps morphing into just something else. So I'm still hoping to find a picture of the man and try to find this painting. I'm dying to see it now.
You're going to find it too. I bet. That's incredible. I mean, that's the thing, is one thing leads to another thing. I believe many great mystery novels could be written based on some of these searches. I mean, just your story as it was unfolding was like incredible. And then to find out that, art education in the DC region was started by, I mean, you must have fallen out of your chair. This is the most beautiful outcome to this kind of a search too, right? Where we're looking for the people that laid the road for us. Like that's
a story in itself. Like you said, to me, this story of doing the story of the research has become another crazy kind of story,
I'm curious, we have a little less than 10 minutes, but one thing I really wanted to ask about is, how do you, when you tell these things to your students or you share this work with your students, how do they respond? Do you feel like they have this natural curiosity to follow the meandering path as well?
I think there's ways of hooking them and getting them really jazzed about it. But one thing I started to do last semester that I taught, or no, probably 2 years ago, is I just take my entire pile of material that I've gathered from online, digging in archives, meeting people who sent me stuff, which is like mind-blowing to me. But I take all of it, make sure it's labeled, and I just share it with them. And then we make interpretive work out of it. one really crucial thing, I think, is just if you get some important stuff, you can't hold it, because then you're keeping it from other people. And another like sort of intrigue and excitement builder with students, I think, besides just like giving them the full pile of stuff, which works with high school, but you have to be tidier, um, is it's talking about time travel. It's talking about the real power of going into history and changing what you thought happened in the past by finding new information that will change your trajectory moving forward. And in doing that for yourself, how meaningful is that for you to do for your students, right? Like, it is powerful and life-changing. Can't always hook up like a perfect oral history interview, although it did work really well in Paulina Camacho's class. We worked on this, and then the people who were at the center of these events were able to come to class and talk to the students who maybe thought I was making up a lot of stuff, but to hear it unfold, they were like, holy smokes. And then this person says, yeah, and they, and then the police attacked people, right? And it really happened. I think the impact of this is really so huge on people's concept of who they are and what kind of a role they could have. And also finding out that these were, imperfect beings just like them. You can't wait for an invitation to demand something better. And you can't wait for yourself to become perfect to make a move. I was waiting for someone to deal with this history. And then it was me. That was the punchline.
I would say, and I would say basically from last semester, which Nicole came and spoke to our class, and I think that jazzed them too. But at the beginning of the semester, I told them this whole story, the whole gritty details of the Hunster story, which you just got a skimming of here. And I could see the students really going like, what, And so the idea was like, they had to do 3 things. One was the Margin to Center art project. They had to give a presentation on somebody in art education that we might not know about, whoever they wanted to research. And they had to write a research paper. And what I found is a lot of them were really interested in digging into their own experiences. Like, some of them interviewed their parents about their art education. I had one, because the students worked in pairs on the presentations. One of them were looking for LGBTQ art educators or artists. And they found, and I can't remember, blanking on the guy's name, but they found the person who taught Norman Rockwell and who was just kind of in his shadow, right? In a sense. But it was interesting because all of this information was shared with everyone in the class. So that means, they're not only getting what we talk to them about as a teacher and about research, but they're learning how to research, and they're learning how to find these people in the margins, and then, develop them so that they can use them in the curriculum that they're going to develop as pre-service teachers as they go out there. So we know that they're adding, because they're getting it in our classes. And that means that their curiosity is sparked, and then hopefully they'll go out and spark their own students' curiosity to do the same, to research your family, research your neighborhood, find out your story, and, make sure people know what it is and why it's important. So I think they just kind of felt like, oh, do we have permission to like look at our own story? Of course you do. That's what we need to know about. So I think, having that, giving them that sort of idea about what research can be. It doesn't have to be this thing that's like so far removed from who you are as a human being, that everyday story. Like, I think about my grandmother's diary. She probably didn't think anybody would be interested in them, but she lived through a lot of stuff between 1903 and 1996. A lot happened. And, she put it all in her diary. So I'm just saying, things that we don't think people will be interested in, even in our own selves later on, it could add a huge, piece to the story. And I think teaching students about that is important so that they can recognize that it's not just these, prestigious people who are considered important, whose story is, worth knowing and can give us some insight into our times So.
Thank you both. We have 3 minutes left. And I want to do a quick fire question. What is the most notable thing you think you've found in an archive? Notable could also be, I don't know, strange, fun, something special.
I would say it wasn't in the archive. It should be, but it was a testimony from one of the lead organizers of the Harrison High School walkouts, when she told me that, just in passing, that the police officer who is widely known to have, or believed to have, murdered Fred Hampton was their school security officer at Harrison. And many of y'all know where I stand about police in schools. Anyway, changed the way I thought about it all.
Wow. Just wow. I'm trying to think. I don't know if there's anything super notable other than it's always interesting to me to find like finding my great grandfather in some of these archives that that was kind of surprising, finding his work at the museum there. But I really was happy when I found that little photo of Hunster's work that I kept reading about, that little diorama, and there's one photograph that exists, and I knew what it was. To me, that was really exciting because I haven't found his image yet, but I found that piece that everybody's been talking about. And I do have a funny feeling that some part of it is at the Sumner School archive, so I want to go back there. Because somebody said, Pam, they had these really funny cloth things I saw there. I was like, okay, wait, I got to go back there and check again. It was also interesting that at that archive, they had drawings from the early era of vocational education, like the students' drawings of, lamps or different things when they were starting that back then. That place is just a miraculous little place. It's got all these photographs. The other thing that was interesting is finding Frances Benjamin Johnston's photographs. So she was a kind of privileged white woman photographer who was one of the few women photographers who had their own studio in DC in the 1890s. And at the time, she was taking pictures of students at both the colored school system and the white school system. And it was just so interesting to me. You see these kids at the Corcoran, none of whom are Black, looking at these famous works. And then you see pictures of the Black kids standing in front of a statue of George Washington outside. And I remember Hunster writing in his notes that he lamented that there was no museum he could take the students to see actual works of art. And so he created his own in one of the schools. He put all these artifacts in this room. He created his own little museum. So things like that were really interesting. I'd say finding his own words about what he was doing was probably really fascinating for me.
Thank you both so much. We're right at 3:30. Thank you everybody for coming. This is a wonderful conversation. And just a reminder, we do have that the feedback survey. So if you'd like to share your thoughts, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for the invite, and thanks everybody for